Welcome back, everybody, to your bi-weekly update on the state of the Discworld. The great Discworld Readalong, as I, in my hubris, called it. Point is, we're here to talk about Book 5, Sourcery. And this time I'm almost as quick as can be with the recap. We had our discussion on Sunday. So this is really quick. And you have a lot of time to jump in for the next one if you haven't yet. This is Weird Sisters, Book 6 publication order, coming, like our discussion will be on Sunday, the 19th, I think. Sunday the 19th of September. Join us in the Discord. I'll link it down below. Join us for the discussion. Read along. You have 2 weeks. It's a short book, and it's another great entry point into the series because it's the first. Well, it's technically the second one, but the first one where you really establish the whole witches sub-series. So that's something you might want to consider as a starting point for this one. So, without further ado, it's almost 10 a.m. Time to open a beer, right? Well, cheers. Alright, so Sourcery is book 5 in the Discworld series, and it brings us back to the characters, or one of the characters of the first 2 novels, by which I mean we're back with Rinswind, whom we've met in Color of Magic and The Light Fantastic. Now, this brings us to the point where we for the first time can see how those sub-series have specific characters, and we'll see more of that once we've gotten through the Witches series and had a first stab or two at the Watch sub-series. We've now obviously seen the first Death book with Mort, so we can see those individual sub-series develop very specific characters and characteristics that make them unique. But this one's Rinswind, and we're going to talk about what makes Rinswind stories. And the first thing there I feel is Rinswind stories are a bit more on the funny side, on the absurdist side, compared to, say, what we saw in Mort or in Equal Rights. They obviously also have all kinds of deeper themes, and we're going to talk about those in a minute, but they also focus more heavily on parodying literature, making parodies of specific subgenres of fantasy. We've seen the sword and sorcery part in The Light Fantastic, The Color of Magic. We've seen a bit more of that in The Light Fantastic with the Cohen the Barbarian, and there's, they are more focused on the subversion or the playing with tropes of the fantasy genre compared to other parts of the series. So, that being said, let's have a quick look at the overall plot of the book, see what goes on, see what are the main themes, and then look at some of the better or worst jokes and see if there's really bad parts in the book or not. So the overall plot is that a sorcerer is born, which is something like a super mage who has very specific powers that are beyond average wizardry, and the boy comes to Unseen University, and all of wizardry, well, almost all of wizardry, falls for it, takes all the power, and nearly destroys the world. We have a conflict between organized wizardry and creative sorcery, which seem to be opposites, and that's leads to what we might call almost like a World War scenario where spells are flung about. There's certainly some kind of You could certainly make it an analogy towards the end of the Cold War, which is sort of where this book was written, like late 80s, early 90s. So you can certainly look at the idea of threatening nuclear war and nuclear extinction as a theme if you want, although it's not too explicit. It's more like the kind of thing that it like chimes with or resonates with, I guess. So while that happens with wizardry, Rinswind once again gets drawn into an adventure. That adventure, obviously, being that he is co-opted to help the Arch-Chancellor's head to escape. Arch-Chancellor's hat gets stolen by a thief, and needs to escape the sorcerer to avoid the end of the universe, sort of. And we have Rinswind's plotline being on the continent of Klatch, which is the Discworld analog of, or analogy for, or version of what you might call mostly North Africa, the Levant, and the Middle East. I guess that's sort of what you can say. We're going to talk about that in a minute, if that is a problem or not, in the way it is portrayed. But that's sort of where it comes from. So the genre that is parodied heavily here is what you might call the stories from the 1001 Nights or the Arabian Nights entertainment, depending on which translation, adaptation, or whatever you have consumed. I'm talking lamps, genies, rings, and so forth. Evil, grand viziers, the whole 9 yards. So that's sort of, compared to the sword and sorcery pulp stories of the 1930s, that is sort of what the first 2 Rinswind books are looking at. This one is taking a shot at these stories. So that's the second big storyline in this book, and that's about it. We have assorted other things going on. Rinswind saves the world in the end, and yeah. Let's talk about the themes, right? Oops. So let's talk about the themes. Now, obviously, the first interesting theme here is the theme of parentage, or child-parent relationships, because what we have here is a situation where a parent, the father in this case, Ipslaw the Red, lives vicariously through his child, and that's a danger that a lot of parents face with their children. We want our children, well, I don't want children, but that's a different thing. There is always the danger that you expect your children to do all the things that you never could do for whatever reason, and want them to be better versions of yourself, instead of just being themselves. And we have that a lot in this book, with Ipslaw basically, when he's supposed to die, and turning into putting his soul into the wizard staff that is guiding, commanding, and so forth, young Coin, the sorcerer. And we see how that goes horribly wrong for a lot of reasons. First of all, Ipslaw is not exactly a nice person. Second of all, children are not really always not meant to listen to their parents all the time, for all kinds of reasons. So that's like a first theme that we see in this book, and I feel it's important to read it under that direction, because we can see the struggles. We see Coin is not very happy with what his father tells him to do, or the staff tells him to do, and to look at the idea that parents trying to make children into miniature versions of themselves is a bad thing. I guess y'all know that already, but it's interesting to see it in a book. So what else should we look at? Another theme that is heavy here is obviously the idea of the seduction of power. What the sorcerer offers is raw power, raw magic for the wizards to use. And they do that. And just like everyone who has suddenly a lot more power than they are used to, well, not everyone, but lots of people, they use it to address all the petty slights they feel they have ever gotten. They overindulge in the power. They go and behave like terrible people. They imprison the patrician. They change the world to whatever they think the world should be like, without any regard for anyone else, which is important here. It's like power makes people disassociate from everyone else. Power can leave like elites in whatever way, in their own very, very weird bubble. And you can see that in our world, obviously, when you look at whether it's political elites or financial, economical elites, it's the same thing. You suddenly come to a point where rules don't no longer apply to you, and you just make your wishes, your will, whatever the reality that other people have to live with, which is terrible. Now, obviously, this is fantasy, and Terry Pratchett is using this, turning this up to 11, but still, it's something to keep in mind. It's also like just to be aware of how easily we tend to abuse power or any kind of advantage that we have, because the other side is what we need. What we need for that. That's the deeper discussion here, right? The discussion is like, why do you need organized wizardry? And the answer obviously is that organized wizardry makes sure that you don't do these kind of things. And you can look at organized wizardry as an example of what you might call laws, what you might call morality or morals, ethics. These are things that we as humans, because we are, well, not as stupid as we usually behave, that we as people build up to make sure that we don't fall for abusing every single advantage that we find. Now, obviously, there is a lot of problems with that, because most of us try to then go and suborn those rules that we built up for ourselves. But the general idea is there that and it's the kind of thing that you find in your Thomas Hobbes, Leviathan, or any kinds of other, not any kind, but a lot of other like philosophical treatises on like how to build a society. It's very much about how to make human nature be less natural, I guess, or less terrible. And the wizardry versus sorcery thing is just an example for that. Shows us can be seen as a cautionary tale to be aware that if we get offered unlimited power, most of us probably won't be up to the challenge of that. Which, also ends exactly with the ending of the story, with the sorcerer stepping away from reality because that temptation is just too big. So what you do, and that's like the biggest magic of them all, the most important one, is the magic of not using it and stepping away from it, which kind of echoes the idea of not using magic that we saw at the end of Equal Rights. Just like reiterates that in a different way, which once again kind of makes sense, right? All right, let's look at what Rinswind does. Rinswind is, I guess, like a very specific character that is very fascinating in a lot of ways, because he is a coward, he's a self-declared coward, and he just falls and stumbles into adventures through his attempts to not stumble into adventures, which makes for good comedy. That's the point. It's something of a running gag, but it's still like a very good one. And he does the same thing here. He escapes from Unseen University because he feels the coming of the sorcerer. Well, he doesn't feel the coming of the sorcerer as such, but he feels that something terrible is happening. So he flees, just to be, caught up in the adventure of the hat. And this is something that we'll see happening in the rest of the series, Rinswind, as a character, is a very passive character. Rinswind is he's more of a catalyst than anything else. Rinsman tries to avoid adventures, and by trying to avoid adventures through ridiculous events, he creates interesting moments and stories and whatnot. Which, he's just like, it can get on your nerves if you read too much of it, I feel, but it certainly works once in a while, and is a nice, I feel, nice commentary on. There's like actually in a later book, I think, a commentary on the Eternal Champion, which is obviously the construct in Michael Moorcock's universe. The Eternal Champion, whether it's Elric or Corum or any other of those. And Rinswind thinks of himself as the Eternal Coward, so he's like the antithesis to the Eternal Champion. And he is that kind of commentary on your serial heroes, whether it's your Conans, your Fafhrd, Trog, and Grey Mouser, those people that are actively pursuing adventure all the time, and he's trying to actively avoid it all the time. And we get shown that we can just as well have a cool adventure story with the very opposite of that crazy, adventure-seeking barbarian hero. The other part, though, is that it shows how ridiculous the idea of your wandering adventurer is, just as much as your idea of the fleeing adventurer, I guess. So we have that part of Rinswind. We then have him meet Konina, which brings us to another one of those eternal Terry Pratchett themes, the theme being gender roles. Now, we spoke about that in Equal Rights. Here we have the daughter of Cohen the Barbarian, who wants to pursue a stereotypical female role. She wants to be a hairdresser. But her barbarian inheritance makes her extremely good as a thief and adventurer. And she's constantly fighting those like instincts to go and kill everyone to pursue her dream of becoming a hairdresser. Once again, we're talking about the idea that who we are born and who we want to be is not always the same thing. Who the society thinks we are is even a different thing, and the way Pratchett does that is actually pretty interesting, because for the most part, at the beginning he just talks about the thief, and he does that like a couple of paragraphs long. He talks about the thief and so forth, and he studiously avoids using any pronouns. So he plays with the expectation of the reader that this will obviously be another dude. So once we have the scene when she takes off her hood, and we're like, oh, this is a girl, and it's like, yeah, but why would you be surprised by that? It never said anything else, so why would you be surprised by the fact that the thief is female? So Pratchett deliberately plays with our expectations when it comes to gender roles with that character. Obviously, because this is a Rinswind story, it's more light-hearted, more over the top in a lot of ways than, say, it was in Equal Rights, or will be in later books like Monsters Regiment or Men-at-Arms. So they go to Kalach, which is what we're going to talk about next. And the problem there is that Kalach is obviously built on new stereotypes of the Middle East, and well, partly also Africa, but mostly Middle East, at least this part. And the question there then is this Orientalism, or is this making fun of Orientalism? And it's kind of difficult to say. I would say Terry Pratchett is deliberately using stereotypes that are shown, or stereotypes that are in all kinds of literature and about the Middle East. And he's deliberately using those to make us realize how ridiculous some of those stereotypes are. When you think about it, while there are obviously local foundations for the stories of 1001 Nights in India and Arabia and where have you, the version that we in the West know are, whether it's your Disney, Aladdin, or all kinds of, or your Sinbad movies, are very much from a Western perspective. And Pratchett plays with that when he depicts these places. And that's sort of my way of reading it. It still sometimes feels a bit like awkward, I would say, in some regards, especially if you're not familiar with the type of media that he's looking at, which I guess is a problem that will become more prevalent because that kind of, 50s, 60s depictions of North Africa and the Middle East are slowly fading in like our consciousness, because who's watching that stuff nowadays, or who's reading that stuff nowadays? And this is something that we need to be aware of. This is like a 30-year-old book. In the last 30 years, the world has changed a lot. But to come back to that, he's taking a few parts there. The idea of, once again, riches. We meet, obviously, Creosote, the sheriff of Al-Khali, who is a play on Chrysos, obviously the Phrygian king. I think it's Phrygian. I always keep confusing Lydians and Phrygians because of the music stuff. But Chrysos was a Phrygian king who overreached himself and got conquered by King Cyrus the Great of Persia, according to Herodotus. But it's like the beginning of the, pretty early on in the Persian Wars stories by Herodotus. So if you want to read that, it's actually pretty fucking good, because you have the conversation, the fictitious conversation with Solon of Athens about what actually makes a man happy, or not happy, but, blessed and whatnot, and go read that story. It's actually good, and that's kind of where the idea of like riches crisis comes from. It's worth it. But I've always said that reading Herodotus is very much worth it. But let's not go too much into that. I might want to do a video on like why you should read Herodotus at some point. If you want that, let me know. All right. And what we see here is him trying to be a poet, and he has this idea of how that works, and that you need a wilderness for a poet to live and thrive. So he uses his enormous wealth to have that created for him. And we have all kinds of jokes around that, and we have him compliment in weird poetic verse. That poetic verse is eerily familiar, similar to lines that you might read in the writings of fictitiously King Solomon in the Song of the Beloved. If you've ever read it, go read it. It's one of the more sticky parts of the Bible, I would say. But he uses those to compliment people, and we can see how ridiculous those things are just by, twisting a few parts in there. Anyway, we have the idea of the very, very rich, the financial elite, being completely disassociated from reality, being thrust upon us here under the guise of crisis. Creosote, not crisis, obviously. Which brings us to the next trope that that Pratchett is subverting or making fun of, that being the trope of the evil Grand Vizier. Now, this is something that has obviously, is at the corner of all our ideas of conspiracy theories, because the idea is always that the head of the state is not exactly the ruler. It's someone in the shadow, the one behind the throne, the eminence grise, grey eminence, the Grand Vizier, and so forth. And Pratchett used that and makes all kinds of fun about it, and by showing how ridiculous our prejudices or our cliches of a Grand Vizier are, which good on him. I like that. And from there on, things in that plotline devolve rapidly. We have Rinswind being thrown into the snake pit. We have absolutely grandiose, ridiculous, absurd humor in the snake pit. The conversation with the snake, all of that is just ridiculously good fun. And like, there's a bunch of really good lines and jokes in there. Konina being thrown into the harem because that's what you do as a as a Grand Vizier working for your Serif. And we meet a third person when we play with roles, stereotypes, and that is Nigel the Destroyer, a boy who wants to be a barbarian. And that's cool, right? He has a handbook that tells him all about it. That handbook obviously being modeled on your Dungeons and Dragons player's manual or Game Master's manual, complete with an index of wandering monsters, which I found really funny. And he's obviously not very good at being a barbarian. Now you can see that as poking fun at the idea of people playing role-playing games being very different from the kind of characters they play there, but in, you know, a gentle way. Because Nigel, under all of that, is a decent guy, right? He's a good guy. Anyway, Rinswind and Konina and Nigel and Creosote flee from there. Rinswind goes back to Ankh-Morpork and helps defeat the staff, I guess, and save the universe. We're going to talk about that in a second, whereas the rest is trying to follow them and has weird adventures and almost stops the apocalypse. Whereas Alkali is turned into a, well, disaster area because the wizard's hat fights, the arch-chancellor's hat fights back, and suddenly you have like full-out mage war. So let's look at like a few elements before we wrap this up. One of them is obviously we need to talk about the Aladdin kind of joke because it's a really good one, and that is once again one about privilege. So we have this scene when they come to the secret room and find the magic carpet, the magic lamp, and the ring. And Creosote talks about how his poor father built up the family's wealth with nothing but a magic carpet, a magic lamp, a magic ring, and a cave full of assorted jewels. Which, you know, kind of shows us once again that it is more or less impossible within capitalism to make it from like very poor to very rich, unless you have a lot of luck. But mostly you can't do that by your own skill or whatever. You become rich by being rich in the first place, because once you're rich you can become even more rich, even richer. And that's kind of the joke behind that, which is, you know, not the joke but the other part. We stay in that area because what they do is they travel later on with the lamp, and they call the genie, and the genie is very much your modern day real estate developer, overcommitted, talking about business, and it's very much a parody of people that make money out of nothing or nothing concrete, always in the hopes that the universe, or in this case law, the world, whatever, will not catch on to their scams in a way. Which, once again, is an interesting way to look at the whole genie discussion, whole like genie trope. So I like that a lot. In the meantime, Rinswind goes back and meets the librarian, who is a major player in this book, which I love, because the librarian is probably my favorite Discworld character. And because there's no one else to do it, Rinswind goes and saves the world. He flies up and tries and talks. Well, he tries to attack the sorcerer. Then talks with him. The universal fabric breaks down, and Coin and Rinswind end up in the dungeon dimensions. Rinswind sends Coin back with the trapped gods of the Discworld to release them, to make sure the apocalypse doesn't happen. The Discworld remains, and he stays back. And this is interesting because this is the first time that Rinswind actually consciously decides to do something and decides to save the world. Is he good at it? We don't know. He succeeds, but maybe that was just his luck, I guess. But this is like an interesting twist in his character because it shows that even Rinswind is more than just a joke on legs, right? He has that spark of decency and humanity in the end. Right. What should we talk about? A couple of the jokes that are really cool. So there's obviously once again all kinds of references to all kinds of pop culture and so forth. Death is complaining about the terrible chess games he's forced to play with everyone when they try to avoid dying, which is a reference to a really disturbing movie. If you haven't seen The Seventh Seal, go watch that. It's crazy. Andy Smith made a video where he talked about postmodern movies and named that one. Go watch that movie as well, and go watch that YouTube video. What else? There's a great Casablanca reference in there that I love, when it's like, out of all the disreputable taverns, you had to walk into his. Pretty good. And obviously the 1001 Nights joke that to rule them all. Telling stories in a harem isn't bloody normal. It'll never catch on. Which, made me laugh from time to time. Yeah. Another thing, well, it's not that much left. So, to actually wrap this up, because I can't think of anything more, Sourcery is a more light-hearted story, despite all the violence, all the craziness. It focuses more on jokes and one-liners than like serious debate of themes. It establishes some more parts of the Discworld. By this, I mean Clatch, which has been mentioned before, but it shows up again. It gives a bit more like screen time to recurring characters like the Luggage, the Librarian, and obviously Rinswind, Death, and the other riders or pedestrians of the apocalypse. It helps to establish the general tone of Rinswind stories, and yeah, we'll see where that will go with the next Rinswind story, which is book 9 in the series. It's called Eric. And if you look at the first edition cover, you kind of see where this is going. Apart from that, yes, we're nearing the point where Discworld becomes a more consistent place. I guess the next one, book 6, and then with Guards, which is book 8, we're at the point where Discworld is very much established. So these are the next couple of books that we'll be reading, and if you want to join us for those, these are very good entry points again. Yeah, I personally love Sourcery because I love the jokes, and I'm a Rinswind fan. So I hope you found this interesting. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed it, like, subscribe. If you have read the book, tell me what you think in the comments. If you haven't read the book, also tell me what you think in the comments. Well, maybe, maybe read the book first or whatever. Join us in the Discord and talk with us about it. Also, then in 2 weeks, maybe join us in the voice chat to have like a discussion about it. It's a very friendly place. We've got like newbies in there. We've got veterans in there. We're all over the place. Don't be afraid. It's cool. So yeah, thanks and have a great day. Cheers.